You're shorter than I am. All right, I'm testing this. Yes, it works. Okay. Well, it's just, if that clock is right, it is about 7 o'clock. I haven't heard the church chime yet, but that's always 3 minutes late. So we're okay, I guess. So I thought we would go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming tonight. For those of you who probably know, we're also live streaming this on our YouTube channel. Every time I say that, I just love that. It's like we have a YouTube channel. But I do know a lot of people have opted to do that. As you all know, our friend is back, so I think a lot of people have decided to watch from home, which I understand. So welcome, everybody. My name is Lisa Simpson-Lutz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society. And before we begin, I'll just again mention this is live streamed on YouTube. And for those of you who are watching, feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and hopefully our tech guy, Brian, will be able to relay those questions at the end, because we want you to be involved. So also this is being recorded, and all of the lectures in this series have been uploaded to our website, CastineHistoricalSociety.org. If you have any problems finding them, please just give us a call and we'll walk you through how to find them in the labyrinth of the website. So this is the last lecture in our series of the program entitled Hidden Legacies, Uncovering Castine's African American History. This series was partly funded with a grant from the Maine Humanities Council, and it focuses on the untold stories of Maine and Castine's African and African American population from the late 18th century to the early 20th. This series is a result of several years of ongoing research by the CHS staff and a commitment by the organization to uncover, tell, and preserve the unknown, forgotten, and even hidden stories of Black individuals and families who lived and worked here in Castine. So looking ahead, we have one more program after this, and that is a walking tour that's going to be led by Georgia Zildjian and myself. That's going to be on Saturday, October 14th at 10 o'clock. We do have to have pre-registration, and it is limited to 15 people so that we can have a good walk. And I should say, if you haven't signed up, you should hurry, because we already have 9 people signed up. So that is going to fill up. And we do have a rain date of October 21st. Maybe there's a possibility, if we have a waiting list, we will do another one on October 21st. So also a reminder that our Clark Fitzgerald sculpture exhibit is up until October 9th, but we are on our fall hours now, which is Friday through Monday. If I would also say, although I know most of you here are members, but if you're not a member of the Historical Society, we encourage you to join. We have out on the table there, we have handouts, we have the most recent newsletter, and we have membership forms. As a membership, you get our newsletter, special pricing for events, 10% discount in our gift shop, plus you help us fund our exhibitions and educational programs like what we have tonight. So I'm thrilled tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mary Freeman, and she'll be speaking on abolition and the Underground Railroad in Maine. Mary is an assistant professor of history at the University of Maine. As a historian, her research focuses on the political, social, and cultural history of slavery and abolition. Her work also explores African American history, women's history in Maine and New England. One thing I learned tonight is she's a Mainer. That was news to me. Grew up in West Bath, yep. But she went on to get her PhD at Columbia University in 2018, never thinking she would be back working in Maine, but here she is. Her current book project, which is being published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, is going to examine letter writing in the 19th century anti-slavery movement. She's going to argue that the correspondence enabled abolitionists to organize as a group and articulate radical ideas at a time when they were excluded from mainstream electoral politics. So I'm very excited tonight to hear from Dr. Freeman, and I'm going to ask her to come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction, and thank you, Lisa, and to the Historical Society for inviting me, and to all of you for being here. I have said this to a couple of you, but it's particularly exciting for me because I've done a number of Zoom online programs, and I'm very happy that we can continue that tradition tonight with people coming to us on YouTube, but also this is my first in-person event for quite a while. Oh, you can't hear me. Let's see. Microphone, is it on? Is that better? Okay, I'll try to talk right into it. Okay, how's that? Is that better? Great. And I'll make one very minor amendment to Lisa's introduction, which is not only did I grow up in West Bath and go away and not really think that it's not that I it's just that I never expected to be so lucky to return to Maine to work. So I'm just very happy to be here with you tonight. So yeah, as you can see from the title of my presentation, I'm going to be talking tonight about one of the most popular and celebrated topics in Maine history, which is our state's abolitionist heritage. And the title of my presentation, the second part, Memory, Myth, and History, speaks to this idea that while we know a lot about how Maine was deeply involved in the debates around slavery that shaped politics in the US in the 19th century leading up to the Civil War, our knowledge of this history is often shaped as much by myth and memory as it is by historical research that's grounded in archives and primary sources. So I'm going to do just a little bit of myth busting tonight. I'm not going to shatter anything, I hope, but just kind of dig a little bit deeper into Maine's history with slavery and abolition, thinking about this complicated relationship between myth and memory and history when it comes to the topic, and focusing on Mainers' involvement in anti-slavery activism and the Underground Railroad in particular. Before I get into it, first, just looking at this image here on my title slide, this is an anti-slavery emblem that was very popular both in Britain and in the United States in the 19th century. If you can't see the details, it shows a kneeling enslaved woman who's holding her hands up in kind of a prayer position. Her wrists are in chains, and above her is the message, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" And I think it's a kind of powerful image that speaks to some of the goals of my presentation, in that it is a more nuanced image than it might appear at first, and it kind of has some contradictions to it when we look a little closer. So the image and the accompanying message are, this powerful assertion of shared humanity. Am I not a woman and a sister? It was used by abolitionists to evoke sympathy with enslaved people as fellow brothers and sisters. There was also a male version of this image that circulated as well, although the version with the enslaved woman was by far, I'd say, the most popular of the versions. So the kneeling pose of the woman, her hands clasped as if she's praying and also half naked and in chains, also reflects how many white abolitionists also saw enslaved people as fundamentally different from them and possibly inferior. So there's a contradictory message, shared humanity, but also a sense of difference. This idea also that enslaved people were passively waiting to be rescued is a very powerful myth that perseveres into the present day, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit later on. And also, this image is reflective of how there's a lot of silence for historians studying these topics, in that the voices of enslaved people are often really difficult to uncover and sometimes are absent completely from the records that survive. So when we're looking at archival sources, we're often looking at sources that provide kind of a secondhand perspective, in this case, the perspective of the white abolitionists who created the image representing the experiences of someone that they felt a connection to, but also still felt somewhat distant from. So, as a theme of my presentation, you'll notice is kind of reading between the lines to get a more complete story of this topic. So, like I said, we're going to look at some common assumptions or myths about Maine history that tend to downplay Maine's historical ties to slavery and celebrate our state's abolitionist heritage. And I'll show some examples of how historical research complicates those assumptions. Again, this doesn't mean everything we know is wrong or anything like that. We're just kind of, adding some layers of nuance to get a little bit deeper into these topics and maybe challenge some of the romanticized aspects that are really popular in the stories we tell about this history. So I like to start with this quotation by David Blight, who's a Yale historian. He's got some gravitas to him. And this is a quotation from an essay he wrote about the Underground Railroad and sort of the problems of memory in telling stories about this topic. So the quotation reads, "Caution especially must be applied to determine just how much we fashion usable pasts, histories that reflect our desire for a particular kind of lineage, individual or collective." So David Blight is a Yale historian. He's a little wordy here. But the kind of key idea I want to pull out is this idea of a usable past, which I think speaks to the idea of connecting the past and the present, thinking about how history isn't just about documenting what happened in the past, but also making sense of it, trying to use it to help us understand our world today. So this quotation suggests how we are often tempted to perhaps present ourselves in a more favorable light, to look for heroes in the past that we can claim as part of our lineage in the present, and that sometimes makes it a little harder to get at the more complicated or contradictory parts of that history. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn to my first assumption, kind of myth assumption that we're looking at today. And based on the other events in your lecture series this past spring and summer, I imagine this might not be news to some of you, that this statement is not entirely, taken at face value. So, assumption number one, Maine was a free state. Slavery didn't exist here. So it's true that by the time national debates over slavery came to a head in the mid-1800s with the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, slavery no longer existed in Maine. But, we unpack this statement a little further, and we can go back to the colonial era in Maine in the 1600s and 1700s, where we find that elite Mainers did own enslaved people. This was slavery in small numbers. There was no plantation agriculture in New England, unlike in the South or in the West Indies, but slavery was still significant here. Slaves fulfilled a variety of working roles, ranging from farm laborers to crafts workers to house servants, and they afforded slaveholders a great deal of prestige. So to dig into this with a couple of representative sources, I have two kind of primary sources to look at here that, to me, illustrate the history of slavery in Maine. So the first one I have up on the screen here, I know it's impossible to read no matter how clear the image is, so I'll unpack it a little bit. This first one is a bill of lading, which is essentially a receipt or a record for cargo carried on a ship, loaded and unloaded. So this is from 1719, and it's a bill of lading for a enslaved woman coming from Barbados in the West Indies. So she came on a ship from Barbados, and she arrived in Maine in April of 1719 on a ship that landed sort of near present-day Kittery. What is really striking about this document to me is that the woman she has no name. She has no kind of clear identifying, way to identify her in the historical record, other than she's a woman. And the one other detail that's given is in the bottom left corner, you might notice that symbol that looks like a Y. That is sort of a drawing by the person who created this document of a scar or a brand, some kind of mark that she had on her shoulder. So she's being identified not by name, not by age, or really anything other than her just kind of distinguishing physical feature, which also perhaps speaks to some kind of violence in her past. We don't really know. This woman was one of 5 enslaved people who originally boarded the ship in Barbados, but she was the only one who survived the journey, and she got to Maine and then died 3 weeks later. Her owner, the man who was receiving her as cargo in Kittery, Sir William Pepperell, was a very prominent early resident of Kittery. He made his fortune trading lumber and salted fish from the Maine coast down to sugar plantations in the West Indies. His ships would then come back up the coast with sugar and rum produced by slave labor on plantations in the Indies that would then be sold throughout New England. So, looking at this, this is one of many, many sources that document Pepperell's life, but it's an oil portrait, so that already is expensive, right? And he's basically emulating the style of European aristocrats. He's got this really, luscious red outfit on, and he's, showing off his wealth and his power in this image. So when Pepperell received the cargo, including this single enslaved woman who survived the voyage, she passed away 3 weeks later, and he wrote a letter to the merchant who had supplied the cargo, and he described this misfortune only in economic terms. He said, basically, this woman had deficient clothing so early in spring, which we all know how cruel a Maine spring can be, and he apologized to the merchant for his financial losses. So looking at these two sources together, we can see that human beings were treated as property even here in Maine. The historical record preserves this expensive, lavish oil painting of William Pepperell, but only a scrap of paper with no name for the enslaved woman and Pepperell's perspective in terms of profits and losses. So even after, I'm moving ahead in time here a little bit, even after slavery was abolished in Maine, which was then part of Massachusetts, during the Revolutionary period, Maine continued to have strong economic ties to the institution of slavery. So this slide shows what often in textbooks is referred to as the triangle trade, but it's really a lot more complicated than that. You can see by all the lines and arrows going all over the place. And we don't really need to get into the intricacies of everything here, but just looking at the perspective of Maine and New England, we know that the economy here was largely based and continues to be based to some extent on maritime trade, sometimes going directly over to Europe, but more often in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, the coasting trade that would kind of travel down the eastern seaboard and wind up down in the West Indies. This kind of trade continued well into the 19th century, especially in coastal port towns, where we are positioned here today. So, connections to slaveholding areas outside of Maine and New England was really strong, both in terms of the West Indies, the Caribbean, as well as, especially in the 19th century, the American South, where some of the really, up-to-date, speedy ships, clipper ships that were built on the Maine coast were built to carry cotton cargo from the South to England, fueling the Industrial Revolution and carrying this really valuable product that was being produced with enslaved labor. So there's still a strong economic connection, well into the 19th century. And famously, Maine also has a political connection to slavery in its statehood era. So again, many may be familiar a little bit with the Maine-Missouri Compromise, the story of how Maine became a state in 1820 and how that was tied to this national debate over the expansion of slavery into Western territories that were acquired from Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase. So again, this map has got a lot going on here. There's a lot of information to take in. But the main kind of message to take away here is that you can see the country that is divided even as early as 1819, 1820, between states that were considered free and states that were considered to be slave states, northern and southern states, kind of giving us a hint of what's to come in the following decades. But even though we see that stark division between free states and slave states already developing on the map, Maine statehood was tied to the admission of Missouri to maintain the balance of power between free states and slave states in terms of representatives in the Senate. So, even though Maine was being admitted as a free state, its admission was kind of predicated on the expansion of slavery into Missouri and kind of setting a precedent for the potential for further expansion of slavery into the Southwest. One thing to kind of think about with Maine statehood is that at the time, actually a lot of Mainers opposed this compromise. They, even though they had voted for Maine to be admitted as an independent state, they were not happy with this compromise because of the connection to the expansion of slavery. But most of that opposition was really not tied to any kind of humanitarian concern for enslaved people. Instead, they were worried about the political consequences that slaveholding politicians in Congress and the Senate would gain more political control and might harm Maine's interests. Yeah, question. That is a great question. Yeah, so one of the many, I like this map because there's so much to unpack. So the red numbers that you can see associated with a lot of all of the states that are considered free states, that marks the date that slavery was abolished. The ones that have ranges are states where some states, including Maine being part of Massachusetts at the time, and Vermont also was one, they passed a law or made a decision sort of, okay, after this time, slavery is over, there are no more enslaved people. Other states chose a policy of gradual emancipation where they passed laws often that people born to enslaved mothers after a certain date would be considered free, but their parents would remain enslaved. So that's why you have such a wide range of dates, in places like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. There's a whole generation of people that sort of witnessed the next generation be born into freedom, but they themselves remain enslaved for either the rest of their lives or until another law is passed that kind of ends the whole thing. Anyway, so yeah, just thinking about this era and Maine's position in it, there's a lot of political contest going on about the issue of slavery, but even that point about gradual emancipation laws suggests how a lot of the people in positions of political power are thinking about this not so much as a humanitarian issue, but as an issue of managing different political and economic interests. So where does that leave us? By the time Maine became a state in 1820, we can see, there's historical links to slavery, there's ongoing economic links, and there's political links as well. And this helps to kind of set the stage for what I'm going to turn to next, which is the history of abolition in our state. All right, so this is my second assumption or myth that we're going to dig into here. And this is the idea that most white Mainers supported the abolition of slavery and equal rights for Black Americans in the 19th century. So this is a tricky one because there is a strong abolitionist history in our state, but when we look a little closer, it might look a little bit different than we might expect at first. So following from the Maine-Missouri crisis of 1820, the admission of Maine as a state, and all the way through the 1850s, most white Mainers and Northerners in general, not just Maine, were not active supporters of ending slavery. For a lot of people, it didn't really affect them directly. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's not in my backyard, so I'm not going to interfere with it. And for African American people who did live in Maine, as well as other parts of the North, those people experienced a lot of racist discrimination. So the question of equal rights for Black Americans was very contentious. Abolitionists were a small minority of Mainers. There were white Mainers who did support abolition, but they were always kind of considered to be this radical fringe. And the first opponents of slavery in Maine were African Americans who were fighting against the racist discrimination they faced and allied themselves with the national movement against slavery. So a lot of my research on abolition in Maine has focused on abolition in Portland, although I've been broadening my geographic scope a little bit, which I'll talk about in a moment. And one of the kind of key figures that's really fascinated me is this man, Reuben Ruby, who was a prominent Black activist in Portland and also happened to be the city's first cab driver. So you can see on this slide, this is his advertisement for his hack or cab business. I think this is from 1834. So he was active in Portland starting in the 1820s. He was one of the founders of Portland's Abyssinian Meeting House in the late 1820s, which I know you had Pam Cummings, who's working with that organization, give a talk here earlier this spring or summer. And the Abyssinian Meeting House really became the epicenter of abolitionism in Maine through the Civil War. So it was, Black Portland activists were kind of pioneering this movement in Maine, including my guy, Reuben Ruby. I have a couple of images here that I think I've been thinking about a lot lately because I think they speak to just the sort of prominence of African American activists in Portland in this era. So this is a map of Portland from 1836, and I know it's hard to see. I have a zoomed in detail in a moment here. So it's about 5 years after the Abyssinian Meeting House construction was completed, and the title of the map is referring to the city's latest improvements and principal buildings. So it's like the biggest landmarks of Portland in 1836. And what I like about this map is that the Abyssinian Meeting House is on here. It is probably basically impossible to see, but here's a close-up version. And the fact that it's featured on the map and there's actually an image of it pulled out with some of these other major landmarks you can see around the edges. Oops. To me, that reflects how the building literally carved out space for Black residents in Portland to worship. It functioned as a church for political activism, including abolition. It placed them on the map of this growing city and really, made them visible in the larger community. I'm not going to linger too long on the Abyssinian Meeting House, so I'm happy to talk more in questions if people have more thoughts. But just a couple other sources. This is a sketch of the building from around 1890 to 1900 that kind of shows, this is somebody who was drawing this building from memory, looking back on his memory of Portland back in the earlier decades of the 19th century, and he also recalled the Abyssinian Meeting House as an important landmark that he wanted to record. And then, of course, we have, the Meeting House building as it looks today and is being restored by Pam Cummings and her wonderful organization. So, this is an example of a building and a community that was very prominent, actually, in the minds of Portland residents in the 19th century. Back to this map here, the image on the map. But kind of faded from public memory for a long time, and now with the efforts of historical enthusiasts and preservationists and funding is now returning to our consciousness, which is really great. But going back to Reuben Ruby for a moment here, Ruby was not only one of the movers and shakers behind the Meeting House campaign, getting this space built in Portland, but he also was really active in bringing abolitionist leaders to the state to give lectures, travel around, and kind of spread the message in Portland, but also far beyond Portland. So William Lloyd Garrison, who's probably the most well-known abolitionist. He's a prominent Boston abolitionist who was the editor of the Liberator newspaper, which is kind of like the primary mouthpiece for the anti-slavery movement. Ruby was part of the group that invited Garrison to come to Maine in 1832. Garrison returned again in 1833 and toured all the way as far north as Bangor. So he, made a pretty comprehensive tour of the state. And as this movement grew, Reuben Ruby, Garrison, and others helped to, build a broader campaign in Maine that was, sort of pioneered by these Black activists, but also brought in white Mainers who joined in interracial activism. But it's important to remember, even so, abolition is still pretty, unpopular and kind of a minority of the overall population. So on this slide, I just have, this is the first page of the Maine State Anti-Slavery Society Constitution that was organized after Garrison visited in May of 1833. And I want to mention the Constitution because, of course, it states that one of the fundamental principles of the society is that slaveholding is a heinous sin against God, and therefore immediate emancipation is the duty of the master and the right of the slave. So, of course, emancipation is a primary goal here. But this society also pledged to, quote, promote the intellectual, moral, and religious improvement of free people of color, and endeavor to obtain for them, as well as the enslaved, an equality in civil, intellectual, and religious privileges. So you can really see the influence of Black activists like Reuben Ruby, who wanted these twin goals of emancipation and equal rights for Black Americans. So pushing white abolitionists to acknowledge not just the injustice of slavery, but also to address the pervasive influence of racism in American society, including in northern free states like Maine. I'll just briefly add here before I move on to the Underground Railroad a little bit, that some of my more recent research has been trying to uncover more information about abolitionist activism beyond Portland. I currently live in Bangor, so of course I'm interested in Bangor, but also just sort of, the areas of Maine that are a little further north and perhaps a little bit harder to track down those records. I know that Lisa has done some research about Castine. I myself have also researched Amos Phelps, who is another Boston abolitionist who had a local connection here in Castine. He also had a connection to Reuben Ruby and his family. So there's, you can find this kind of history when you do dig into the archives and look for those historical sources. It's just sometimes a little bit harder to find than you might hope, I guess. But at the same time, we have to remember that because Maine's economy was so based on coastal trade with the South and with the West Indies, there was a lot of opposition to abolition, even up to the Civil War. People were getting kicked out of meeting houses left and right in these communities. And I'm happy to talk more about that kind of local history and questions if we have time. All right, so moving on now just to think a bit more about the Underground Railroad. This is my third and final assumption that I want to unpack a little bit tonight. And this is this idea that Underground Railroad activity was well organized and widespread among white Mainers. So, you can get a little preview here from the previous topic that we know already that the most consistent support for abolition and for the Underground Railroad came from Black communities in Maine and a small group of white abolitionists who often were operating with a lot of opposition and had to be really careful about their actions. So it's definitely true that the issue of fugitive slaves galvanized more support for abolitionism in northern states, including Maine, especially after 1850, when a new fugitive slave law, federal law, was passed that legally required ordinary people to enforce the return of runaway slaves to their masters. This law, as you might imagine from politics today, was controversial because we don't often like it when the government tells us to do something that we don't want to do. And Mainers didn't like having slaveholders way down in the South essentially using the federal government to reach into their communities and into their homes and tell them what to do and punish them if they didn't follow the law. So this galvanized more support for abolition and for helping fugitive slaves in Maine and throughout the North. Fugitives did travel through New England as part of the Underground Railroad network of activists who assisted fugitives from slavery who were escaping either to find refuge in northern communities or particularly over the border in Canada where the law would no longer apply to them. People learned the stories of the fugitives that they encountered, and that also fueled opposition to slavery. When you have the opportunity to meet and talk to someone and hear their experiences, that is really going to make a difference in galvanizing support for this cause. Probably the most famous Maine connection is Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which really spoke to northern audiences about the heartbreaking crisis of the fugitive slave law, where enslaved people were trying to make better lives for themselves, were trying to preserve family connections, and were constantly facing the threat of being sold away and separated from family members. This book was published in 1852 at the height of the political crisis over the fugitive slave law. It became an international bestseller. Of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe was living in Brunswick when she wrote the book, so that's the main connection. It tugged at the heartstrings of northern white audiences, including Mainers, and again, focused on themes of family separation, particularly parents and children, husbands and wives, that made the cruelty of slavery feel very real and pressing for readers. So in this slide, I have an image from the book, an illustration that is related to the story of Eliza, who was an enslaved mother who escapes from slavery with her infant and is fleeing to Canada because she does not want to be sold away from her infant child and separated. Really a heartbreaking story. If you have more questions about the novel, I'm happy to talk more, but I'll just sort of end on this point by saying that from today's perspective in 2023, there are a lot of stereotypes that come up in this book that make it, feel its age, that it was published in 1852, but it still was at the time really, really significant for getting this message out to thousands, hundreds of thousands of readers. So of all the topics I'm discussing today, the Underground Railroad probably has the most powerful presence in historical memory and storytelling today. Locally, I like to bring in this example of the North to Freedom Monument in Brewer. I don't know if there's anybody out there who's seen this monument in person. It is a little bit tricky to get there. It's in Joshua Chamberlain Park, kind of right over the bridge in Brewer. But I think it illustrates nicely kind of some of this complicated relationship between myth and memory and history. So the position and the subject of this monument were chosen based on local storytelling around the Underground Railroad, that this was the site of a home where the original, or I guess 19th century residents of the home had a family story connection to the Underground Railroad. The tricky thing is that this type of activism was illegal, it was really dangerous, and really kind of like the facts, historical, I'm padding my papers, like documentation of this kind of activism is really hard to find. So this is, a monument to a local sort of story that is embedded in family memory passed down through generations, which is not to say it's more or less valid than other types of historical sources, but the monument itself also has some additional aspects to it that make it an interesting one to unpack a little bit. Certainly there were fugitive slaves who traveled via the Bangor Brewer area on their way to Canada in the decades leading up to the Civil War. But the sort of way that this monument presents the history is a little misleading. There were no underground tunnels that enslaved people used to travel. It's not a literal underground railroad. There's also railroad tracks in another part of the park associated with this monument. Again, it's not a literal railroad. It's more a metaphoric kind of description of how people were traveling. Also, the monument kind of has a mixed message of depicting presumably a formerly enslaved man rising up out of the tunnel, but there's no specific identity associated with him. It kind of harkens back to that image on my title slide of the kneeling enslaved woman. You can get a sense of connecting to another person, you know, this shared humanity here, but a lot of the local stories focus on white abolitionists who helped fugitives without really giving as much attention to the individual experiences or stories or names of the people who may have traveled through the area on their way to Canada, or African Americans who actually lived in Bangor, Brewer, Castine, and likely participated in anti-slavery activism. Their stories are much harder to come by. I think this monument kind of reflects something about our struggle to find meaning in the past relating to our present, and you know, makes us think about how do we actually go about finding more about this history. Yeah, question? Yeah, when we talk about stops on the Underground Railroad, I think it does tend to give us the sense of a fixed network where, you know, much like an actual train station operates. Yeah, exactly. So it's, you know, it's when we actually do the historical research, it's rarely a particular physical location. It's more about the people, right? It's the people that were helping other people, and oftentimes they were doing so taking great risks to, like, even taking their lives into their hands. There were people who were imprisoned, who were killed, not necessarily in Maine, but you know, we don't know the full extent of this history really. So it is, you know, I think digging a little deeper into these stories, there's often a grain of truth, but we have to, you know, kind of expand our sense of what this kind of activism would have looked like with the full context in mind. All right, so I'm going to kind of wrap up here, kind of leading actually right off of this question of, okay, so we have this idea of Underground Railroad activism is so popular. We have this idea of David Blight's usable past in the back of our mind. You know, the Underground Railroad is this kind of positive story that we can grasp onto in the midst of really, really difficult parts of our history, right? The Civil War, the history of slavery, these are topics that are still contentious in our communities, in our classrooms, in the present day. And the Underground Railroad is this kind of optimistic aspect of this that is important, but also needs to be, you know, placed into that broader context. And, you know, specifically thinking here in Maine, there can be this tendency to think of Mainers as separate from and perhaps above the worst aspects of this history, the history of slavery and racism, in this country. And while we have admirable figures we can look to, again, we need to see the full story to really understand how those people look even more heroic. They weren't just following a trend and helping enslaved people to be, you know, part of the popular group. They were taking their lives into their hands. And that, you know, is a really dramatic and important story to know. So how can we start to recover some of the, quote, real history of this activism in Maine? I just have some starting points, you know, honor our local memory, but also explore it, dig deeper, do additional research to try to broaden and deepen our understanding. Keep in mind that sources might be scarce because these actions were controversial, illegal, often secretive and dangerous. And think about the unique position that Maine occupied. You know, we have this rich history of Black activism that some of the other lectures, as well as mine in this series, have started to explore. We have this international border with Canada, which is really important and something that even living here, I think we often don't always think about on a daily basis. And we have the context of Maine's maritime economy, which provides a very strong economic link to slavery well into the 19th century, but also perhaps provides some interesting avenues for thinking about how enslaved people could take advantage of those maritime networks and perhaps escape in a way that in no way resembled what we might assume the Underground Railroad looked like. So I'll end there. I have a couple of links that you might find interesting. One is to the Maine History Journal, which I co-edit over in the UMaine History Department, and includes lots of great articles about our state's history, including some related to the topics I've spoken about today. And you've probably, through some of the other events in this series, already heard about the Atlantic Black Box Project, but I'll just plug them anyway as an organization that's really devoted to exploring the connections that New England has to the history of slavery in a lot more depth than has happened in the past. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to talking more. All right, I see a question in the back here.
You were speaking about the activities of the Underground Railroad being dangerous and illegal. So Massachusetts was an abolitionist state in 1780, which means Maine also. And the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in like 1850s.
Yes.
So there's a federal law from 1850 on, but can you flesh that out?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to repeat the question for the benefit of YouTubers out there. So the question has to do with the sort of chronological gap between 1780, which, not to get too in the weeds here, but the actual date that Massachusetts abolished slavery is still a little bit debated. But sometime around 1780, in the Massachusetts new state constitution that was created during the American Revolution, that document kind of implicitly granted freedom to enslaved African Americans. So you have that date on one side. On the other side, you have 1850, the very controversial Fugitive Slave Act I mentioned in my presentation. So in the middle, there are other pieces of legislation that I didn't mention, but are still making this kind of activism very dangerous and illegal. Just one example, so maybe some are familiar with the creation of the Constitution, and that part of that process was a lot of contention about the position of slavery in that document. And the Constitution does not mention the word slave or slavery anywhere in the text of the document. There are a few places where it comes into play. The 3/5 clause is one. There's a clause related to the future potential abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. And there is a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. That clause does not say, again, the word slave or slavery. It says something basically about persons who are held to service in one state traveling to another state, and the takeaway is that they are still, quote, held to service in the original state they came from. So even in the Constitution, there is a clause that protects the property rights of slaveholders to protect them from the potential of enslaved people escaping across the border to another state where slavery might not be legal. There are further acts. There's a federal act in 1793 that is meant to give more teeth to that act. Or that clause in the Constitution. I always say to my students, this is a great example of why you don't use passive voice in your writing, because in that clause, it never says, okay, they shall be returned to their original place. Who is going to, I think the word is delivered up. Who is going to deliver up those people? It's a passive phrase, right? Slaveholders notice that and they say, okay, we need another law that clarifies who will be doing the delivering up. How is it going to happen? That's the 1793 law. And in between, there are more ways that this is legally debated. The difference in 1850 is that it gives even more teeth to the enforcement of this law that says basically northern states by this point have tried to basically pass state-level laws that are nullifying the federal fugitive slave laws. So the federal law is meant to say, no, the federal government has the ultimate authority, and we are actually reaching into individual people's homes and saying, you must do this or else you will face the penalty of the law. So anyway, probably a little more complicated than you're looking for, but there is a lot of legal history behind this story. All right, I've got a question here, yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, so the question is about records of fugitive slaves. The most famous existing one is created by an abolitionist, a black abolitionist, William Still, who's based in Philadelphia. He has these incredible diary log books where he records the names, the ages, the sort of basic life stories and experiences of the people that passed through his anti-slavery office in Philadelphia, which might resemble as close to anything the kind of storybook image that comes up when we think about a station on the Underground Railroad. And Still is just one of the sort of big movers and shakers behind the Underground Railroad in general. Philadelphia is a big node for this. But you're absolutely right that these sorts of detailed records are few and far between. So part of the book that I'm working on right now, I look at abolitionist correspondence in lots of different ways, but one of the ways that I explore is how they talked about fugitive slaves in letters at a time when it was dangerous and illegal to be doing this kind of work. And there are cases where people are using coded language. They're saying, the package will arrive tomorrow. Or, there's a young gentleman on his way to see you. So there are ways that these activists, get around the issue of surveillance and the issue of breaking the law, and, they're still taking risks. But frustratingly for today's historians, it can be really difficult, kind of fiddly, minute work to really uncover the details of individual people's lives. Just another example of a woman who I've done some research on. Her name was Mary Walker. She ended up living in the household of a white family, mostly in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so still New England, not Maine exactly. But she burned all of her letters at the end of her life, even though she lived through the Civil War. She lived to be reunited with her children who she had been separated from when she fled from slavery. She still burnt her letters at the end of her life, which to me shows that, you know, in some ways, maybe she wanted to kind of retain that control of her life story. She wanted that right to privacy that she had not had for a lot of her life. But also, you know, the legacy of that trauma of feeling like she could be exposed at any moment and that her children could also be exposed and potentially punished. So that just shows, you know, it's frustrating as a historian go in the archive and this woman told her friend, burn my letters. No, I want to read those letters. But, you know, that's part of the story too, I think. Let's see, I've got a question in the back corner here.
President Lincoln is credited with having praised Harriet Beecher Stowe as having done more to end slavery than Congress or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
How's that statement holding out to the historians?
So the question's about, well, I think his statement was something about you're the little woman who started the big war, and that's the famous quote, but also that Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel did more to end slavery perhaps than Congress did, at least up until actually passing the 13th Amendment in 1865. I think it, you know, to me, it speaks to actually the goals of abolitionists. A lot of them looked at the way politics worked at that time and the way slavery was so much off the table. It was so controversial that politicians basically refused to take a stand on it. So a lot of abolitionists said, you know what, that's not going to work. Some of them said, no, we need to work within the system. But there were a lot that said, really public opinion is the key, and they focused their efforts on, again, sending out these lecturers like William Lloyd Garrison, like Amos Phelps, who came all the way up to some of these small towns in Maine. You know, even somewhere like Bangor was not a bustling metropolis in 1834. So, you know, they really did the legwork of sending people to these communities to give talks, to organize societies, to distribute publications, and really focused on this question of getting the public support behind the movement before political change was going to happen. So, you know, in the way historians debate each other, sometimes there's this question of, you know, who really had the most significance in ending slavery? Was it Congress? Was it perhaps the military in, you know, occupying areas of the South and kind of forcibly provoking this question of emancipation? Was it abolitionists? I think, you know, you really have to have all of those parties together, but I think abolitionists really did play a major role in getting that public opinion, getting this to be a topic that everybody was talking about, even if they didn't necessarily agree with everything they had to say. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about the Ku Klux Klan in Maine, which was really powerful, popular in Maine in the 1920s, basically between like 1918 and 1924 was kind of the peak of the membership in Maine. And the question is about, were there sort of antecedent groups, similar types of groups operating earlier in the state? You know, the history of the Klan on a national level, on a state level, is very, I could talk for 30 more minutes about, so I will refrain. But I will say that, you know, maybe not anything that looks exactly the same in terms of being kind of an organized group that's really organized around this principle. In Maine, African Americans as well as Catholics, particularly Franco-American immigrants, were a major target of the Klan in the 1920s. But if you go back earlier, I mean, if you're looking at the period of the 1830s and 40s, there were mobs, or at least threats of mobs, that would gather and interfere with anti-slavery meetings. In the Maine Historical Society collections, one of the letters that I've looked at there is a letter between a local abolitionist and the Portland mayor. I believe this is like in the 1836, where the abolitionists are trying to find somewhere to host a lecture, and the mayor of Portland is saying, no, I won't let you do this because I can't guarantee that the police are not going to support the mob that is going to gather at this event. So that gives you a sense of the opposition to abolition was not necessarily coming from the people that we would consider on sort of the radical fringe of the other side from abolitionists. It was often people with a degree of, public standing, support, authority in the community. Sometimes, very wealthy people would support anti-abolitionist mobs because they had an economic interest in slavery continuing. So, maybe nothing that looks exactly like the sort of organized group of the Klan, but definitely there was the potential, at least, for these kind of violent altercations that we might associate, or terrorist acts that we might associate with a group like the Klan. Yeah. That's an interesting question. So the question is about organized religion, different denominations, and their relationship to abolition in Maine. So the Abyssinian Meeting House, just as an example, was organized as a congregational church to serve the Black community in Portland, which is actually kind of unique. If you look at the history of Black churches throughout the United States, a lot of them are Methodist or Baptist churches. In some ways, like, there were certainly congregational ministers, congregational churches elsewhere throughout the Northeast that supported abolition, but there was often kind of gradations and intricacies to how different sort of factions of abolitionists perceived their movement. So there's a lot of support for abolition from members of Northern Protestant, evangelical, often denominations. There's also a lot of fracturing in those denominations with the Southern branches that are very much opposed to the growth of abolition in their churches. So, to be honest, religious history is not my strong point, but I think you can really dig into some of the local dynamics of how a congregational church in Maine might look a bit different than one in Connecticut or something like that. And it could even vary from town to town. If you just happen to have a minister who heard a lecture that he really got behind, you might have a really influential personality that could make a big difference on a local level, and often might encounter some pushback from the higher ups in the denomination. So yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. Any other questions? Or I don't know if we should go to YouTube. I've kept you here for quite a while, so I don't want to overstay my welcome.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. And if you're so inclined as you're leaving, if you'd like to take your chair and put it back, we'd be thrilled. So thank you everybody, and I hope to see you at the Historical Society soon. Take care.